Hi, my name is Lynn Workenthien, and this presentation is about my inquiry project for 671, Seminar in Literature for Youth. The topic I chose for my project is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation for reading. I was inspired after reading the book Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us by Daniel Pink. It's all about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation and what drives us as human beings. This had caused me to do a lot of thinking about how I motivate students as a current classroom teacher and how I will do so as a librarian. Therefore, for this inquiry project, I decided to look at the relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and reading, specifically for young adults. Shulsky, Capps, Justice, and Anderman, authors of Motivational Attributes of Children and Teenagers Who Participate in Summer Reading Clubs, offer great definitions of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators. They define extrinsic motivators as external, tangible rewards provided for completion of a task, such as when a child receives an allowance upon cleaning his or her room, and intrinsic motivators as internal to an individual, such as one's personal interest in a task or the pleasure derived from completing it. My initial questions before beginning the inquiry process were as follows. What is the best way to motivate students to become lifelong readers? How can I use intrinsic motivation to encourage students to read? And what are the benefits and drawbacks of using extrinsic motivators? For my inquiry model, I chose the Alberta model. The main reason I chose this model is because of its nonlinear nature, which is important for inquiry. It conveys that during the inquiry process, one can move forward and backward and don't have to perfectly follow a series of linear steps. I also like the reflection piece in the middle, showing that the researcher should be reflecting throughout the entire process, not just at the end. The only aspect of inquiry that the Alberta model doesn't include, though, is the affective part, the emotion that the researcher feels throughout the process. I felt that this was very important to include, because I know my students benefit from knowing their feelings during the process are normal and expected. For this, I referenced Carol Kuhlthau's ISP, or Information Search Process, Affective Stages of the Research Process. Throughout the search process, my inquiry questions remained the same, although my search terms and my focus evolved. For instance, at first I focused on finding research about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation in general. And then I narrowed down my search and limited it to only results about motivation and reading. While researching motivation and reading, it became very clear that intrinsic motivators are the best way to motivate young adults to become lifelong, wild readers. Extrinsic motivation, giving rewards and incentives, can actually decrease intrinsic motivation once they are taken away. The first time I saw this happen, I was flabbergasted. We had a school-wide reading incentive program several years ago, and I had several students who read like crazy for those couple of weeks, and I was so excited. So imagine my disappointment when they stopped reading altogether once the program is over. This is a perfect indication that extrinsic motivators can decrease intrinsic motivation when they're taken away. Most research I found supported this idea that intrinsic motivation is better, although many do agree that there is a time and place for extrinsic motivation, such as when tasks are boring and repetitive and have no inherent intrinsic motivation. Therefore, after discovering this, I focused my inquiry on my second driving question: how do I use intrinsic motivators to motivate students to read? One research study I read was slightly discouraging at first. It showed that personality traits actually factor into one's intrinsic motivation to read. But the researchers said, don't be discouraged. There are some things that teachers and librarians can do to increase intrinsic motivation. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a single concrete answer to the how question, but I did glean some insight and some ideas from my research.
Created using Powtoon.